Hello and welcome to another episode of the Calumet Wilderness with Sam Love. I am your host, Sam Love. It's Halloween, it's October, it's time for eerie adventure. Checking out the old historic cemeteries in Gary, Indiana. We started off in Miller Cemetery on the east end of town. Now we're moving over more west in the sort of the edge of what was the old village of Tolleston. So stick around, we're going to do 2 for 1 in this episode, Tolleston and Waldheim Cemeteries. I've always seen this portion closest to Grand Street called Tolleston Cemetery and the far back portion, Waldheim. And I'm not sure if there's a relationship between the two actually. I was hoping to find that out, but I couldn't. But of the two, I think Tolleston is the youngest one. The oldest stones date from the 1870s. The most recent are up in the 1950s. Whereas Waldheim, the oldest ones date from the 1860s. And continue all the way into the 1980s, early 80s. This cemetery is maintained by the Calumet Township, and it looks like they've just been out because there's a lot of bagged debris. So it's good that's being taken care of, mowed, so a bit easier to walk through than the Miller Cemetery was. Not as dramatic as the Miller Cemetery either. The High Tolleston shoreline on this part of town, west end of town, between the old Midtown and Tolleston is it's much more subtle. You know, the ridges are a bit shorter, you know, maybe 4 or 5, 6 up to 10, 12 feet. Every older person from Gary I know that's lived in this part of town has stories about playing in low sand hills, and I'd love to collect all those together sometime. But you really have a great example of it preserved in Tolleston Cemetery. Tolleston was an old German village that was founded in 1857 by George Toll. I've heard a lot of people out here, the old timers, call it Tolleston, but my generation, I guess, says Tolleston. Grew very slowly. By the 1870s, you had maybe 70 families living out here. And this would have been the far western edge of the village. So according to Find a Grave, there are 191 listed memorials here. It doesn't really look like it. A lot of stones have been unfortunately kicked down and gotten damaged over the years. The earliest ones date from the 1870s, and the most recent are from the 50s, and the majority are in the middle, sort of the early 20th century up to 1920. So I think of the two, Tolleston Cemetery is a younger one. Well, here's a plot. Gibson, that's a name associated with this part of Gary for a very long time, pretty much from the beginning of recorded history. Of course, there was Mother Gibson, who ran the Gibson Inn, which is located at what's today 15th and Madison. This is the first white people to settle here. And this little corner of the cemetery has some of her descendants. My friends, the Decay Devils, did a wonderful event here back in 2000, sort of a Halloween haunted storytelling event in the cemetery. And then we had some ghost chasers come down too. So that is my memory of the cemeteries here. So Waldheim Cemetery, the best way to get there is from the corner of 19th Place and Pierce. I always forget that entrance is pretty tucked away back there. Waldheim is the oldest. The oldest burials date from the 1850s, and there's quite a few from the 19th century in here. The most recent one is 1982. And according to Find a Grave, there's 711 memorials here, known and recorded. Lots of German names in here. Probably the best known family in here are the Bormans, who settled in Tolleston long before Gary was created. That name is familiar because there is a very noisy highway to the south of here that I can hear. And I think the airplane going overhead is appropriate for a Borman reference. Probably the best known Borman to us, Frank Borman, who the noisy highway is named after, the well-known astronaut, born here in the 1920s. And many of his ancestors, including his, I believe his grandfather Frederick, who would have been the immigrant that settled here in the 19th century. This has more of a nature preserve feel than Tolleston Cemetery does. I kind of like the touch of these tall grasses around the stones, leaving them unmowed, going to seed. There's a handful of natives growing in here, although looks like it's more like invasive plants, mulberries and whatnot. The catalpa trees add a bit of drama too, I have to say. Yeah. I've been out here at night. It is a little eerie, even with a bunch of people. Well, I think between Tolleston and Waldheim, the latter gets the more eerie award. More claustrophobic, more grown over. The stones are quite dramatic here. Yeah, very interesting. Well, Tolleston, very briefly, was an incorporated town, 1906, after Gary was created. And by 1910, it was annexed into the city. But in those 4 years, the town boundaries ran basically from the Wabash Tracks down to about the 25th, the little cow wetlands, and then from Grant Street west to Klein, which is the western border of Gary today. So a very brief moment in time, and then it becomes a distinct city neighborhood. Very interesting part of Gary out here, and I think it's really cool that you can see not only some of the old village lines, but just the traces of that old culture that was out here. Well, I hope you, as a child screams in the background, they're on the swings in the playground of the old school. Hope you enjoyed this eerie adventure, another one of the great cemeteries in Gary, Indiana, where we can get a bit of cultural history and ecological history. I'll see you in another episode. Take care. There's been some land clearing here, but there are 2 memorials up there still, so heaven only knows what is underneath. And that fence line there between the living and the dead is pretty arbitrary, I'll bet.
Walter.
I'm gonna have to jump on Google Street View and see what this looked like before they came and clear cut everything. You know, we did not know that there were some stones outside of the fencing of the cemetery. It's kind of unfortunate. Just come chew it all up and oh, hey, boom,